Prices of basic goods rose at a slower pace in February for the first time in 6 months. The Philippine Statistics Authority says inflation hit 8.6% last month, slightly cooling from 8.7% in January. Transport was the sole driver of the deceleration. Let's now get the thoughts of Chinabank Chief Economist Domini Velasquez on this latest inflation report. Domini, thank you so much for joining us. Should we feel relieved that the inflation rate slightly dipped to 8.6% in February, or is it still a concern?
Hi, Rico. Good evening. Well, for us, we're a little bit relieved. The BSP actually projected inflation to be around 8.5 to 9.3%. And a 9.3% is really worrisome. It will hurt consumers. It will reduce their purchasing power or the value of their money. It will rouse petitions for higher wage and transport hikes, and then thereby starting another round of inflation pressures. Also, it provides some relief for businesses since now we expect slower rate hikes from the BSP. It will reduce their cost of doing business. However, I guess one thing that we're really concerned is about food inflation. Food inflation is still double digit at 11%. And if you look at the CPI basket for an average Filipino, food is just maybe around 35% of an average Filipino's basket. But for the poor, the bottom 30% of the population, food makes up more than 50% of their CPI basket. So if you look at the PSA also releases their inflation for the bottom 30%, and that's a whopping 9.7% compared to what we got for February.
So you're concerned about food inflation. What must be done then to be able to bring food inflation down? Because if you take a look at the 8.6%, Domini, it's not across the board. In Metro Manila alone, prices accelerated at a faster pace of 8.7%. And in Western Visayas, it had the highest number at 10.8%. Prices in other parts of the country are still high.
Yes, that's true. Actually, for maybe half of the regions, flat prices actually peaked this February, or might have peaked this February, meaning their inflation rates were higher compared to January. When we were looking at the data, this is also driven by food inflation. Sometimes utilities for some region, particularly electricity prices. I guess together with the national, what will happen to the national inflation or headline inflation for the whole Philippines, we expect inflation to go down to all of these in all of these regions also. So, the Philippines, just this morning, I think Secretary Jokno mentioned this interagency task force monitoring inflation and market outlook, release demand and supply of food. And that has been the problem in the past few months, right?
Yes.
It's really domestic shortages in food items.
And Dominic, you mentioned about Secretary Jokno. He keeps on insisting that inflation is going to fall all the way to 4%. I mean, it seems far-fetched at the moment that we are at 8.6% and we will go all the way down to 4%. Is this realistic this year?
Oh, well, if you really look at, I guess, mathematically speaking, right? Because last year, inflation was increasing towards the end of the year. Starting March, we were at 4% last year already. And then up to maybe around 8% by end of the year. Inflation will really trend down just because of base effects. But what's worrisome is that, when prices go up, it tends to be sticky going downwards. So it does not tend to go down easily. So it's quite hard to reverse inflation. Inflation is just a growth rate and not the level. The level is really increasing. But 4% is realistic. We think also 4% around November 2020.
So it's still very far away. I mean, if we hit 4%, we're only in the month of March. And of course, the key policy rate right now, Domini, is at 6%, and it has risen a total of 4.5% in 2022. Isn't monetary policy or high interest rates working? Are we likely to see another aggressive rate hike to be able to bring prices down to 4% by November?
Well, I think two sides, right? You have demand inflation, which the BSP is trying to address and have really been addressing since last year. They've been quite aggressive in tightening their monetary policy more than other Asian central banks. But there's also supply shocks, which is domestic food shortage, which cannot be addressed by monetary policy. And that has been the problem in the recent months.
Yeah. Domini, we seem to be jumping for joy, although cautiously, about this 8.6% in February. But it also isn't comforting that the Philippine inflation rate is the highest so far in Southeast Asia for February. Its neighbors Indonesia and Vietnam have lower figures of 5.5 and 4.3%.
Well, that's true. You know, in 2022, we were maybe at the same level as Thailand. We're both importers of oil. So we really were affected by the high oil prices and the war in Ukraine. So even Thailand was registering around 7% inflation last year. But this year, I think it has been emphasized enough that really, it's really a domestic problem already, domestic induced problem, where we don't have some of the basic commodities. There's some ill timing in terms of shortages and importation. Let's say sugar end of last year and onions now. And I think recently we're seeing shortage in local garlic.
Yeah. So with this interagency being formed to try to bring down food inflation, what does this mean now for monetary policy? Briefly, are we likely to see the Bangko Sentral raise rates once again, and by how many points or by how many percent in 2023?
Well, we think this lower than expected inflation this February, the Bangko Sentral has room to raise by a slower 25 basis points. Might be the terminal rate already. The next meeting after the March meeting is May. So we'll have two inflation prints and then the GDP Q1 figure already, looking into how much the previous policy rates have taken into effect, or how much has it impacted economic activities.
Domini, thank you so much for your perspective on the February inflation numbers. Chinabank Chief Economist Domini Velasquez.